that old expression, when life gives you lemons, make lemonade? Well, try this one on for size. When life gives you a swamp, make a floating garden. And from those floating gardens, well, let's just say the produce can be pretty attractive. I just love doing this. I mean, bringing people to a Mexican produce market and showing them the incredible supply of fresh fruits and vegetables. And why do those American jaws drop when they come into a place like this? Well, most of the time it's because folks are conditioned to think about Mexican food as being heavy, as being all starch and melted cheese, as being okay in flavor, but certainly not strong on color, as being all beans and no greens. Well, this certainly proves all of that wrong. But there's another reason that those jaws drop, and that's because so many people haven't ever seen anything quite like this. They haven't seen this abundance, this freshness, this ripeness. Well, of course, unless they shop regularly at a farmer's market. It's like a veritable temple of fruits and vegetables. And if you kind of roll that all up with the three Mexican staples, the corn tortillas and the beans and the rice, well, you've got what I'd call a vegetarian's paradise. Now, if you lived here in pre-Columbian times, then your diet probably consisted of the occasional fish and fowl, because if you lived here in a place like Monte Alban, well, then you were part of the nobility. But the everyday folks and their everyday diet, well, it was pretty much fruits and vegetables, almost entirely vegetarian, very little fish or fowl. So those pigs, those sheep, and the cows weren't known around here at all until after the Spaniards arrived. It'd be like having a Kentucky Fried Chicken open up right across the street from your house, and you had no idea where Kentucky was. You'd never eaten anything fried and never seen a chicken in your life. Okay, so maybe that analogy's a little bit off, but basically, when the Spaniards brought their domesticated animals to the New World, they were adopted quite readily. Well, and eaten too. But for centuries, eating meat for most Mexicans has been more the exception than the rule, something that you'd enjoy, once or twice a week, but not something you would expect to have every day, as we do, and most of them do too. And since meat was so coveted, it was the perfect thing to give up for Lent. Now that's a tradition that the Spaniards brought with them too via the Catholic Church. The Lenten season was supposed to encourage penance and privation, but with so much attention put onto the Lenten diet, well, it actually encouraged the cooks to be more creative. They created dishes like fava bean soup with chile pasilla and nopales, the cactus petals and potatoes simmered with chile guajillo or chile ancho, or maybe a simple mole with greens. Those are all national treasures that people look forward to now for Lent. So that's the lesson. Learn how to cook with great bold flavors, and eating your vegetables won't be any sacrifice. So between Mexico's history of innovative farming and the natural creativity of the everyday cooks, you can develop a pretty different attitude about vegetables here. I mean, they don't have to be just the bland boil things on the side of the plate that you have to eat before you get dessert. In fact, vegetables here can actually be the spirit of the meal. If you just know how to dress them up, sort of put them in their best light, why they can become complex and vibrant and really satisfying. In fact, vegetables can be the star of the show. Now in central Mexico, they have these wonderful little preparations that they call tingas. Little smoky, tomatoey stew, if you will. Typically made with shredded pork or sometimes shredded chicken, but every once in a while, you'll come across a vegetable tinga. Typically, it'll be made with calabacitas, this little Mexican zucchini, light-skinned zucchini. Now, it's similar to our zucchini, but certainly smaller. So if a recipe calls for 4 of these, then you'll probably want to put in 5 or 6 of these. But there's some other differences in flavor and texture as well. Let's cut one of these up here. Cut the ends of it off. And you'll notice right away that the flesh of it is very compact. And when you cook it, it's going to have a beautiful sweetness to it that you won't find in our typical Italian dark-skinned zucchini. Next stage is to saute it and to brown it a little bit. I'm going to pour some olive oil into a hot pan, and then the zucchini will go right in there and we'll brown it. Now that zucchini is just perfectly brown, so I'm going to lay it out onto a baking sheet to let it cool off a little bit. You always want to cook the zucchini in an uncrowded layer in a large pan. Now that pan went right back on the heat. In goes a little bit more olive oil, and I'm going to put some sliced onion in there to brown. And with it, a flavoring that's almost always associated with tingas. Chorizo, Mexican sausage. And you can find all kinds of brands of chorizo commercially available around the United States. But if you live in an area where there's a Mexican grocery, go in and see if they do a homemade style one. It's always interestingly flavored. I'm going to cut this open here. This is just one of those plastic casings, and add the chorizo directly to the skillet. Tear that up and put that right in there. Now, if you want to make an all-vegetarian version of tinga, that's possible too, because we're going to make a sauce now to season this that's going to have smoky elements. And that's going to underscore the same kind of flavor you get out of chorizo that's really good. So we start off with some roasted tomatoes. Those are roasted under a broiler about 4 inches away for 5 or 6 minutes per side. When they're blackened and blistered and completely soft throughout, that's when you take them out, let them cool, and then peel off the blistered blackened skin. Put those into a food processor with some roasted garlic. The garlic is just done in a dry skillet for about 15 minutes, still in its little papery skin, turning it until it's completely softened. It too will become darkened, almost blackened in a few spots. Then when it's cool, peel off that papery skin, put it in the food processor along with those tomatoes, and here's our magic ingredient. This is canned chipotle chili. Now, this is a smoke-dried jalapeno that's been reconstituted in a kind of tomatoey, vinegary mixture that they call adobo. Very easy to use and very, very tasty. Adds a nice spiciness, but also a beautiful smokiness. We're going to make a little puree out of those elements. Then add a spoonful of salt to our sauce base. And let's take a little look back at the chorizo and the onions. These will take about 5 to 10 more minutes for that chorizo to get completely cooked and the onions to be brown. Now, if there's a lot of rendered fat from that chorizo, you're going to want to tip it off at this point. And then the sauce base goes right into the skillet. And I'm going to add to that about a teaspoon of Mexican oregano, the whole leaf oregano, crushing it between my palms. That goes in there. And we'll let it cook for about 5 minutes to sear and thicken. The brown zucchini goes into the reduced tomato chorizo mix, and then stir it all up just to heat that zucchini through. This is a great dish to just serve with some warm tortillas to make little soft tacos. Or, sometimes I'll just mix it with a little bit of boiled pasta, great pasta topping. Or sometimes just serve a spoonful of it alongside a roast chicken, whatever's your preference. It goes into a serving bowl. This aroma of that chipotle, that smokiness against the brown zucchini is just beautiful. And then a sprinkling of this is a very typical element to do. A sprinkling of Mexican fresh cheese over that. And you've got a dish that really makes you appreciate fresh produce, especially if it comes out of your own garden. Garden? I didn't garden for years. I mean, like lots of people, I lived in an apartment and thought I didn't have a place to garden. But then one day I got this urge to buy a few herbs for a sunny kitchen window. Nothing special, just some chives and some thyme. But then I was bitten. I decided that I wanted to add some exotics like Mexican oregano and some hoja santa, epazote, grow a little micro tom tomato in a pot outside the back door, some chilies and braising greens like New Zealand spinach. And I learned that I could do it all organically. I learned to build soil, how to make compost out of kitchen scraps so that I could nourish all these plants naturally. Well, the next thing you know, I've made this big pot of mesclun. You know those really delicious greens that you can cut and then a couple weeks later they'll have grown back? Well, now I garden in my backyard and, well, I grow more than just a pot of mesclun. In fact, I've got row after row of it that I can plant in succession so we can harvest it to use in the restaurant. Well, gardening has taught me a tremendous amount about diversity in nature. I mean, just look at all these different kinds of chilies. Well, they're the same ones that they grow in Mexico, and I can grow them right here in my backyard in Chicago. Behind these huge towers of the little cherry tomatoes, there's 22 varieties of heirloom tomatoes. That's wonderful. Texture, color, flavor. I mean, these things have been grown for over 100 years. Now, some gardeners like flowers, other ones like vegetables. But when it comes to squash blossoms, why, you get the best of both worlds. I'm going to show you a lightning speed vegetable soup with a dynamite Mexican flavor. It all starts with a pot of simmering, flavorful broth. And to that, I'm going to add some chopped white onion and some slivers of jalapeno chili. Now, though this is a really fast soup to make, it's elegant when you serve it. So you want to cut out all those little veins and seeds from the chili before you cut it into slivers. That's going to go right into the pot, and we're going to let that all simmer for about 7 or 8 minutes. Then slide in some chopped tomato, and remember those little blossoms that I brought in? Well, if you're growing zucchini or squash or pumpkin of any kind, then you can make this a very special soup by using some of those blossoms. Let me show you what you do. You choose the male blossoms. Those are the ones that don't have any fruit formation here at all. Take the little sepals off around the outside. Those are really quite tough. You don't want to get those in your finished dish. Then you can pop off the end of it like that. And what'll come out is the little pistil there. You don't want to eat that either. And then tear them into small pieces. You can find these at farmers markets a lot too. And those are going to go right into the pot with all those other delicious vegetables. A good sprinkling of fresh cilantro, and we'll let it simmer for about 3 minutes. A ladle of steaming soup over some fresh avocado. Then a little squeeze of lime to perk up the flavors. And what we've really got here is just a very rustic soup that we've made very elegant by the addition of those squash blossoms. Why, this is often called in Mexico sopa xochitl, named after the Aztec goddess of flowers. And of course, there's an interesting story in that. The floating gardens of Xochimilco, where the spirit of Xochitl still lives on. It's been a very popular tourist destination for a really long time. It's easy access for people that live in Mexico City to come down on a Saturday or a Sunday. But if you can get past all the flowery frills of the place, it's a pretty amazing legacy going on here. In fact, it sort of stands as a living monument to some of the cleverest agricultural engineers in the world. Now, the history of the place, sort of like the waters have been in years past, is a little murky. But what we really do know is that the basin that contains present-day Mexico City used to be covered by a series of shallow lakes. And when the Aztecs arrived here, they found a fairly sophisticated society in its agriculture. It was a society that had built a series of canals through some raised planting beds that they called chinampas. And those chinampas were productive enough to supply the corns and the beans and squash, chilies, tomatoes, practically everything that everyone in the valley needed. Well, it was such a smart use of land and of water as well that the Aztecs adopted this chinampa style of agriculture as well. And when the Spaniards arrived here, they were just amazed by the productivity of this chinampa. Nevertheless, the chinampa farmers have dwindled to a small, dedicated group, and to tell you the truth, they've focused more these days on decorative flowers than on sustaining food crops. Yet, the experts still contend that the chinampa is one of the best forms of agriculture that's ever been invented. And this is basically the way the story goes. Instead of praying for rain, you go to where there's always water, like a shallow lake bed, and then you bring in porous soil. This kind of volcanic soil works perfect for this style of agriculture. You build it into some manageable size fields, and then of course all the fields are connected with canals between them. What you dredge up from the bottom of the canal becomes the perfect organic fertilizer for your rows. The crops, of course, are germinated and grown out here, and then after harvest, what vegetation is left here deteriorates very quickly in this porous and moist soil, keeping it very fertile. Now, this cycle not only turns out some pretty amazing produce, but the canals that are connecting all of these fields teem with fish. And then birds, of course, are attracted both to the foliage and to the fish, and you've got a perfect system. With one little chinampa, you could be living large. You got your fish, you got your fowl, you got your produce, all in one perfect self-sustaining system. Now in Chicago, in my garden, I can't even grow chayote. Seems like we don't have a long enough growing season. I can certainly grow plenty of the zucchini, the Mexican round style zucchini, but neither one of them really inspire a whole lot of enthusiasm by most people because they're thinking about the bland, watery, boiled version of these two vegetables. But I think that chayote is underrated if you just know how to cook with it. You can bring out subtleties and sweetness. But before you do that, of course, you've got to buy it. So when you go into the grocery store, look for the smooth-skinned, really firm, unblemished chayotes. And the good thing about them is that you can put them in your refrigerator and keep them for several weeks, and they'll still be good as new. Now, a lot of people like to split these and then stuff them. Why, I've even had a dessert made out of chayote down in the southern Mexican state of Tabasco. But today, I'm sort of in the mood to make a chayote casserole. And the first step to making it is to cut the chayote up. And cut it in half first, and you'll see that there's a little pit right there. Take that out. And then either peel it or not, depending on whether you want your casserole to be real rustic or more refined. Cut the chayote into 1-inch cubes, and then a lot of people will boil it at this stage. I say don't. I say steam it, because that will preserve its natural sweetness. Put the top on and steam it for about 15 minutes, stirring every 3 or 4. Then the steamed chayote, still sort of crisp, tender, goes into our casserole dish. I'm going to sprinkle on a little bit of salt because it hasn't been seasoned yet to this point. Spread that out just a little bit and on to the seasonings now. One of the most important seasonings in this is roasted poblano. It's done typically over an open gas flame, turning it until it's evenly charred and blistered on the outside, then letting it steam as it cools under a kitchen towel. Then rub off those charred skins and take out the stem end and the seeds and rinse them quickly and slice them up into little pieces. You could also buy some roasted peppers, even jarred roasted peppers, to do this casserole. It'll be delicious, but I like the flavor of poblano. Now I've got little onions and garlic that have been sauteed. These will add a sweet element to the dish. And then a sprinkling on top of thyme, not too much because it's dried thyme and it's kind of a strong flavor. Some Mexican oregano to go over the top of that. And then I'm going to put on some fresh corn kernels. Let those fall down over the whole thing. Okay, and on top for our liquid, a bit of milk goes into it. And our crowning glory will be a little bit of grated melting cheese. You could use Monterey Jack or a little bit of cheddar cheese, but in this situation I'm going to use some Mexican Chihuahua cheese. I'm flattening everything out and then sprinkling that cheese over the top of it. Bake at 350 degrees, and when it's really boiling away, sprinkle on some buttered breadcrumbs and bake another 20 minutes or so. Browned and crusty chayote casserole. Cool glass of uncomplicated Chardonnay, or perhaps some Sauvignon Blanc with its citrusy, grassy green freshness to go with the flavors of the vegetables and the herbs. Add to that a basket of crusty bread, and I can't think of a better summer supper. So, being healthy, being creative has become kind of hip. But that's the way with trend. You know, what goes around comes around. Sometimes it just takes a few hundred years.